There are different seasons in life where we have different conversations. Sometimes it's natural for us in the springtime to kind of talk about the birds and the bees, right? In Minnesota, it might happen a little bit more in the wintertime. But the reality is that this is an important conversation. How do we talk to our kids about intimate relationships, especially relationships that lead to children? And how do we have these conversations in a way that doesn't make kids nervous or conscious of sexuality or sexual things all the time? Sometimes these can be dark places for parents, but Dr. Kathy has some great insights today and a really important resource that I think will help us have meaningful conversations that guide our kids well to honor the Lord in this moment. So let's turn now to Dr. Kathy Cook.
Don't be afraid of the dark. Be careful with stars. Not every light is gonna guide you, baby. Not every light is gonna guide you.
So, Dr. Kathy, a recent World Magazine's report highlighted a new resource called the Holy Sexuality Project. It's off of a recent book by Christopher Yuan. The writer explains it this way. He says, quote, "It includes challenging topics and terminology that may take quite a bit of discussion and prayer to begin to apply to all of life. For instance, a section on the influence of secular philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau may be particularly challenging. Still, Yuan's rich biblical content and thoughtful analysis make his series worth the time and effort to engage." The writer goes on to say, quote, "Today's parents know a one and done talk with our kids on the birds and the bees doesn't cut it anymore, if it ever did. The Holy Sexuality Project by Christopher Yuan and his ministry team can equip Christian families to seek God's wisdom on the topic together," end quote. Now, I love this kind of review in World, partly because I just love when things take you deeper into life. And I think I'm really excited about digging into this video series and the book because it's going to pull in kind of the nerdy side of me. If it's having a hard time dealing with philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and it's pushing us to think about all of life kind of in terms of that, I'm just super excited. But sometimes we have this sense as parents that our kids can kind of understand like the mechanics of sex, or they understand that we need to be mindful of how we dress or those other things. And we've kind of informed them, and our job is kind of in some ways done for the most part. It's been accomplished, right? Our kids know about sex. Why is that thinking problematic? Kind of in the way that the writer of this article kind of highlights, and also the way that Yuan's Holy Sexuality Project kind of emphasizes. Why is thinking that we're kind of just a one and done perspective on this topic is really problematic? And what's kind of a better way forward when we think about this?
I appreciate that we're talking about this. So I'm going to first say that I've known Christopher Yuan for, maybe 15 years. I would consider us friends, and I love his program. His book is excellent. And this video training that you can use in your churches and with your families is very, very solid. So I'm glad that we're talking about it. Can kids understand sex today with one conversation? Absolutely not. Did it ever work? I'm not so sure. So much of, I think, sex ed is, experienced in action after a mommy and daddy talk and the reading of a picture book or a couple of Bible verses or whatever. But, nowadays, sex is just messier, right? Because there's bisexuality and there's homosexuality and there's the trans issue and there's, sleeping around and there's promiscuity for the married couple and it's just messy. And the kids are aware it's messy because the mess is louder and it's in front of us on our screens, and you just don't know what your kids are seeing and hearing. And, the lyrics of songs are suggestive, and TV shows they're watching have, I remember watching, when I was a kid, like what was it? It's not important, but rarely did the mom and the dad sleep in a double bed. Husband and wife married, but they're in single beds. You never saw the bathroom. Think back to the old TV shows. You never saw anybody in a bathroom. And so that's just changed. And so because of that, we have to be careful and be available and have, deeper conversations, age appropriate, right? I'm always talking about that. Like when a kid says, "Where do babies come from?" Ask yourself, why is my kid wanting to know that? And what would be an appropriate answer for, this 4 or 5-year-old little kid? And they want to know where babies come from because you took them with you next door to the neighbor when you dropped off muffins because that lady just had a baby. And your son just held a newborn and smelled a newborn for the first time ever. And he's very interested in where that baby came from. So he needs a pretty simplistic answer. And part of that doesn't even have to be sex. But then when you get into it, how do you answer it? How do you talk about it carefully, wisely? considering your kid and their maturity and why they're asking. And, is your story the one to tell or somebody else's story the one to tell? Or maybe there's no story yet and it's just fact-based. Lots to think about. One of the things I would say, Wayne, is that every parent would be wise to know how they're going to answer the questions before they have to. So be thinking with your spouse, if you're privileged to be married, about how are we going to answer the question when they want to know. What were you doing in the bedroom last night? It was pretty noisy in there, Or, what do you mean you're pregnant? How did that happen? Like, how are we going to answer those questions? Be ready so that you're on the same page with your spouse and you're not totally shocked and surprised.
Yeah, I think that's really important. That's kind of goes to something I've always wrestled with. And I have these conversations with our kids, and I find myself oftentimes trying to really have a serious conversation about it because it's natural to kind of joke around a little bit about it, right? Like to have kind of some levity or bring some lightness to the topic. But I find that there's times where I kind of have to pull my kids away and just say, hey, this is really serious and this is really important. And having really kind of pointed times where, this isn't something to joke around about or be crass with. And that kind of leads me to this next kind of question that I have. And that is, I've always wrestled with having these conversations kind of in an ongoing fashion without sex and sexual expression being the conversation. So we walk outside and we see somebody dressed in a different attire, right? If I could put it in a dad-splained way, it might be that I feel like somebody is wearing their sister's clothes out in public, right? They don't really fit the way that they should or they were designed to. But inside of that, it's natural for us to have the conversation because it's important to have the conversation. But I feel like sometimes we always talk about, this topic, relationship, or, kind of Christopher Yuan's perspective of having holy sexuality that's really kind of set apart. And we're talking about it kind of in a cultural context, but it feels like every conversation can come back to that conversation, the birds and the bees, or sex or sexual expression. It seems like that's what the world is doing. Is there a way for us to talk about this topic without it always being driven around that hypersexualized cultural moment?
I don't know. It's a great question. If there isn't, because you're paying attention as a dad, and so you're bringing things up to your kids, you see that a girl is underdressed and she's showing things that should be for her husband only if she's going to be married someday. You see that there are guys who are looking and laughing, and you know what they're looking and laughing at. And you point that out to the guys. You said, that's disrespect. That a woman, no matter how she's dressed, does not deserve that kind of behavior from young men. How would you have responded if you would have been a part of that group? So I think you look for teachable moments, and we're foolish if we don't use them because it is complex today and it is everywhere. I like to say when I was a child, they'd sexualize toothpaste. If anything was sexualized back when I was a kid, it was toothpaste. Use this brand and your life will be better. Now everything is sexualized. Buy this car, wear this outfit. It's this perfume you need, right? Whiten your teeth. Everything is sexualized. And we live in this world. And so we're foolish if we don't let our kids know. And maybe we say to our kids, I'm going to bring it up again. And I don't want you to go, radio silent on me because you feel like you've heard it all before. It's changing, and it's changing rapidly. And it is our ministry to you to help you be prepared for the world. And so let's talk about what we just noticed in the movie theater. So I think it's a balance there, right? Consider your kids. Don't always wait for them to come to you and ask because they may not, because that's an awkward thing for a kid to bring up. So maybe you simply say, hey, did you notice what I noticed in the movie theater tonight? The kids over on the left. Do you want to talk about it?
Yeah.
Let them know that you saw it. Let them know that you're available.
I love that. I think that goes to this whole idea of kind of building character and calling your kids to have a certain type of character or a certain type of identity. When we look at that specifically, in what ways do you think kind of the world's sexualizing of identity and kind of identity formation really kind of impacts them? It misses the mark, I feel like. But I think also what they're calling out is kind of a hunger inside of kids for identity. So maybe I want to ask the question this way. In what ways do you think the world addressing identity from a sexual perspective kind of gets identity formation correct? And in what ways do you think the world is missing the mark when they looked at identity formation from that standpoint?
It's complex, right? So identity is broad. We have intellectual identity and emotional identity, social identity, physical identity, and spiritual identity. It should be current, not past, not future, but current. It should be complete and positive. There's a lot that I teach about that. So the sexual identity, I guess that's part of physical, part of emotional and social, I suppose, too. We are created for relationships. So we are, in marriage. God designed sex to be a beautiful thing in marriage, especially when you're committed to your spouse forever. And that's an important thing to teach. I would prioritize character above everything else. Our most important part of our identity is our character identity. And are we pleasant? Are we outgoing? Are we confident? Are we honest and kind? Are we loving and careful and compassionate and generous and resilient? And those are all things that would make me want to love you well and would help you love me well. So I wish we would talk about those things. I believe that one of the reasons we have the crisis we have with, kids who are celebrating that they're bi and celebrating that they're trans, and they don't even know what they're talking about. They're just looking for their belonging moment. They're looking for the red carpet so they're not invisible anymore. If we did a better job of teaching the whole of identity, who are you intellectually, emotionally, socially, physically, and spiritually? Who are you? Who do you want to be? If we did a better job of the foundation of the whole of identity, then I think the person's sexual identity would not become the standard that they wave the flag about.
As Dr. Kathy was talking about this hypersexualized moment and how we can guide our kids well by having meaningful conversations, it reminded me of a meaningful conversation that I think happens inside of Scripture, out of Ephesians 5. And I'm going to begin reading at verse 21. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands, as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle, or any blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they were freed and cared for their body, just as Christ does for the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife. The two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. I think sometimes just kind of taking a swing, so to speak, at these different conversations with our kids, that can build inside of them a sense of security, that these are places that we can talk, and we can talk about hard things or things that might feel awkward in our family. I think taking those steps will show our kids that there is a light at the end of some of these dark tunnels that they're facing as they're maturing and growing up, and that they have somebody walking with them. And I hope that's an encouragement for you today, to stand in the gaps, to be somebody who faces the dark with their kids. I want to thank you for listening to the Celebrate Kids podcast in this, our daily segment, Facing the Dark. We're running a year-end giving campaign. Part of the campaign is designed to get Dr. Kathy some space and some margin in her life to continue building meaningful resources for all of us as we raise our kids. Today, Dr. Kathy is on an airplane. She's flying to Chicago to meet with a number of people about some key ideas that she has for books coming up. We're in a fun time in ministry where Dr. Kathy is just fielding a lot of ideas and working through them and seeking out experts to help her communicate these ideas to help inspire us as we parent our kids. Would you pray for her today? And if the Lord leads you, would you join us in this? You can join us financially by visiting celebratekids.com/give. That's celebratekids.com/give. Just go to our webpage. You'll see the link there. And we really encourage you to follow us in different ways as we're creating more resources and more content to give you inspiration, encouragement, confidence, and clarity as you face really dark moments inside a culture. On behalf of Dr. Kathy Cook, my name's Wayne Stender. Thanks for listening, and we're looking forward to seeing you here again tomorrow.